Hi, folks, and welcome back. We start off this week talking about the corporation as a moral person. Our initial question is going to be whether corporations are the right sort of entities, the right sort of things or beings to be held morally responsible for their actions. They're not simply persons in the way that biological human beings are taken to be persons. Persons have a mind, they have inherent rights, they have a mouth for speech, they have limited lifespans, they have emotional responses, and corporations are not like this, right? They don't have a mind, at least not in the same way. They're not biological. They don't necessarily have limited lifespans. They don't have a mouth for speech. They can only speak through the mouth of a biological person or of an AI, I suppose. And they don't have emotional reactions to the circumstances they find themselves in. So are they the right sort of thing to be held morally accountable? French is going to argue, Peter French, who we read for this week, is going to argue that corporations are people too. That is, that they can be full-fledged moral persons and have whatever privileges, rights, and duties as are in the normal course of affairs accorded to moral persons. So he's going to answer the question in the affirmative. Corporations or firms are the sorts of things that can be held morally responsible. They're the sorts of things that it's right to make moral judgments about, that it's right to hold accountable in a moral way, not just a legal way for their actions. And that's an important distinction. We're not here concerned about the legal personality of corporations. We're not concerning ourselves with whether it's appropriate to hold corporations legally accountable for their actions, legally accountable for their behaviors, or whether they have legal rights and responsibilities, rights and responsibilities with respect to the law of a given country or with respect to international law. Of course, corporations do. They are legal persons, but legal persons are just fictions that are the creation of the law. The law itself decides what's going to count as a legal person. The law itself decides if this pre-existing entity of a corporation or of a biological person or of a child or of an orangutan or of a dog is going to count as a legal person. That's not our question here. Our question is whether it's appropriate to hold corporations morally responsible. Whether we can say, well, they lived up to the letter of the law in this case. They did what was legally required of them. But what they did was still wrong. It was morally wrong. And moreover, it wasn't just the CEO who was in the moral wrong, or it wasn't just a particular agent acting on behalf of that organization who was in the wrong. It was the organization itself, the corporation itself. And French is going to answer this question in the affirmative. He says, yeah, they're full-fledged moral persons. Of course it's appropriate to hold them morally responsible. So what's at stake here? Why do we care about answering this question? Well, one thing that's at stake here is the common practice of holding corporations to be morally responsible for their behaviors. We often talk about Twitter or Facebook or other social media companies failing in their moral duty to protect their users from abuse, or to ensure that public debate is fair, or to protect us from false information that's being spread through these mediums, or to find ways to prevent radicalization through these mediums. And we think that they have a responsibility to do this even absent any laws requiring them to do so. In fact, we justify laws requiring them to do so on the basis of this pre-existing moral obligation in some cases. So we want to be able to make these sorts of judgments that Facebook and Google have moral duties, that BP violated its moral obligations when it failed to failed to appropriately clean up the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, or that Exxon violated not just legal obligations but moral obligations when it covered up the evidence that it had for decades about the effects of fossil fuels on climate change. We also might think that organizations or that corporations have moral responsibilities to their shareholders. Right? So it's been said, for example, that Google has a moral obligation to pay as little tax as possible, or that huge banks, for example, have a moral obligation to adhere strictly to the letter of the law, but to do whatever they can within the letter of the law to enhance the returns for their investors. And we think they have a moral duty to do this for their investors, a moral duty with respect to their investors. So there's a lot at stake in that respect. We want to be able to use this sort of language. We talk in this sort of way. And if it's the case that corporations are not appropriately held morally responsible, then all of this language is poorly used at best, is false at worst. These claims just are not true if moral responsibility is not something that attaches to corporations as corporations. We also have this sort of lingering feeling that there is a distinction to be made between a mob and a corporation or a firm, right? That mobs are not to be held morally responsible, that they don't make decisions in the right way, act in the right way to be held responsible for their behavior as a whole. Individual members of that mob, individuals who destroy property or who injure others, are to be held morally responsible for their actions and legally responsible for their actions. But it makes no sense to hold the mob as a whole legally responsible for its actions or morally responsible for its actions. But that's not true of corporations. We do think that there's some sense in which all of the members of the corporation as a unit are morally responsible for the corporation's behavior, even if no individual within that organization is appropriately held morally responsible. We might let the individual people off the hook, but hold the organization itself to be morally responsible for its actions. And if we want to hold up this sort of pre-theoretical distinction that we want to make between a mob and a corporation, well, we'd better be able to say why it is that corporations are the sorts of things that can be appropriately held morally responsible. So, in order to do this, in order to make this argument, we really face two questions. And we're going to take these two questions in the next two videos one at a time. The first question is, what sorts of entities can be held morally responsible for their actions? What makes it appropriate to hold biological persons morally responsible for their actions? What are the necessary conditions for being held morally responsible? And then the second question, are corporations those kinds of entities? Do they have the right characteristics? Do they count? So that's where we're going next, and I'll pick up in the next video.